The millionaire's mornings were always the same. He woke before dawn, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't sleep. His mind was too sharp, too restless, forever calculating numbers and deals. The world outside his mansion rarely mattered. Neighbors were just shadows beyond the gates, their chatter an irritating background noise. He liked it that way. He liked control, order, silence. That morning, as he stepped out with his usual black coffee, he already had a scowl on his face. The garbage truck had rattled past earlier than usual, its grinding metal claws making him curse out loud. A dog barked furiously down the street, adding to his irritation. Every morning, this circus, he muttered, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. He was ready to march to his car, shut the door, and disappear into tinted glass and leather silence. But then he heard a voice, small, soft, and terribly out of place in his world. "Will you walk me to school?" He froze, his hand on the gate. Turning his head slowly, he saw her. A little girl stood on the sidewalk, staring up at him with eyes so wide they almost looked too big for her face. Her hair was in two uneven braids, the kind done quickly by small hands, and her backpack sagged low, stuffed to bursting with notebooks and crayons. One sock had slipped halfway down her leg, but she didn't seem to care. The CEO narrowed his eyes. "What?" he snapped, certain he had misheard. "Will you walk me to school?" she repeated, with the same quiet determination, as though she were asking him to pass the salt at dinner. She didn't flinch at his tone. She didn't shrink back from his sharp suit, his scowl, his air of wealth and distance. He stared at her, dumbfounded. People usually wanted things from him: money, contracts, opportunities. They came with smiles painted on like masks, with rehearsed pitches and greedy eyes. No one ever asked him for something so ordinary, so human. He opened his mouth to refuse, out of habit, out of pride, out of the certainty that this wasn't his problem. But the words stuck in his throat. For a brief, confusing moment, he didn't see her. He saw another little girl, years ago, tugging at his sleeve, asking if he could come to her school recital. His daughter's voice, long buried under years of absence, echoed in his ears. He tightened his grip on the coffee cup until his knuckles whitened. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to say. The girl didn't seem troubled by his silence. She just shifted her weight from one sneaker to the other, her braids bouncing slightly as she tilted her head. "It's just down the street," she explained, as if she were negotiating with him, softening the request with logic. "My mom leaves early for work and, well, I don't like walking alone." The words fell on him heavier than he expected. He had spent a lifetime hearing sentences that carried price tags: partnerships worth millions, contracts signed with ink and greed, conversations weighted with ambition. But this, a child simply admitting she didn't want to be alone. It was too bare, too simple, and it unsettled him. His jaw tightened. His default mode was refusal, quick and absolute. He hated the inconvenience of human needs. He could almost feel the word no pushing against his teeth, ready to escape. And yet, he hesitated. Her eyes never wavered, full of that unshaken belief that adults would do the right thing. When had anyone last looked at him that way? Not as a man with money, or power, or something to give, but simply as someone who might help. He cleared his throat. "I'm not." He stopped himself. What was he going to say? "I'm not the type. I don't have the time." Both were true, and both sounded hollow even before he spoke them. The little girl tugged at the strap of her bag again, this time more firmly, as if ready to march on without him if he refused. There was determination beneath her smallness, a kind of courage he couldn't quite place. For the briefest moment, he admired it. And then a ghost rose up in him. A memory, sharp, unwanted, of his daughter's voice years ago, asking, "Daddy, will you come to my play?" He had brushed her off then, too busy with business dinners and looming mergers. He hadn't remembered what the play was even called. He'd thought it didn't matter. But standing before this girl, he felt the weight of all those excuses like stones pressing on his chest. "Fine," he muttered at last, his tone rough, defensive, as though agreeing were a defeat. But just this once. The transformation on her face was instant. She grinned wide, her whole body lighting up as if he'd handed her the keys to a treasure chest. "Okay," she chirped, already turning toward the sidewalk as though she had expected his answer all along. He stared at her for a beat, his coffee cooling in his hand, wondering why such a small thing felt so impossibly heavy. They set off down the street together, though together was a generous word. The CEO walked stiffly, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, eyes darting toward the ground as though embarrassed to be seen in this situation. The girl, on the other hand, skipped ahead, her sneakers slapping the pavement with careless rhythm. The early morning sun warmed the street, scattering golden light across trimmed hedges and cracked sidewalks, but he hardly noticed. All he could feel was the strangeness of this moment. Him, the man who owned half the city's skyline, reduced to a reluctant escort on a suburban sidewalk. She didn't seem to mind his silence. In fact, she filled it easily. "My teacher says we're going to build volcanoes today," she announced cheerfully, as if she were delivering a stock report. "With baking soda and vinegar. Do you think it'll explode all over the desks?" He glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "Explode. Not like kaboom explode," she said, giggling, her small hands flaring dramatically in the air. "Just fizzy explode. Like soda, but bigger." She tilted her head at him. "Have you ever made one?" The CEO almost laughed, but caught himself. "I run a company," he said flatly. "I don't make volcanoes." She shrugged, unbothered. "You should try it. It's fun." Her words slipped under his armor more easily than he liked. He found himself watching her as she chattered about rockets, the solar system, and how she wanted to be a scientist when she grew up. Her vocabulary was clumsy, her facts half right, but her excitement was unstoppable. He realized she wasn't talking to fill space, she was talking because she believed someone was listening. Him. Against his will, he asked, "Why rockets?" She brightened instantly, bouncing on her toes. "Because rockets go far. They don't stay in the same place forever. They fly away and see new things. I want to see new things too." He swallowed hard, staring straight ahead. Rockets. Escape. He knew that feeling all too well. He'd spent his whole life building rockets of his own. Businesses, deals, acquisitions, except none of them had taken him anywhere he wanted to be. At the school gates, she turned and gave him a quick wave. "Thanks for walking with me, mister." Then she darted toward the cluster of children waiting by the entrance, her laughter floating behind her. He remained where he was, staring at the school doors long after she had vanished inside. For the first time in years, his carefully ordered life felt unsettled. And strangely, that unsettledness felt like the beginning of something. He stood by the school gate longer than necessary, his polished shoes planted firmly. On the cracked sidewalk, children streamed past him, their laughter ringing in the cool air, but he didn't move. He wasn't sure why. Normally, his mornings followed strict choreography: coffee, car, office, boardroom. Precision. Control. Yet here he was, watching a little girl vanish into a sea of backpacks and bright jackets, feeling strangely unfinished. Finally, he turned back toward home. The street seemed different now. The houses, which he usually dismissed as dull copies of one another, carried hints of life he had never noticed. Curtains fluttering from open windows, a smell of toast and eggs drifting from somewhere, the sound of a radio playing faintly behind a hedge. The neighborhood was alive, ordinary and imperfect, and somehow more vivid than the glossy perfection of his mansion. When he reached his gate, the iron bars looked taller than usual, heavier too. He slipped inside and let them close behind him with a metallic clang. The silence of the house wrapped around him instantly, thick, cold, and absolute. He had always prided himself on that silence, on the absence of clutter and chaos. But today, it pressed down on him like a weight. He set his untouched coffee on the counter, realizing it had gone lukewarm hours ago. The kitchen gleamed, all marble and chrome, yet felt utterly lifeless. No crumbs on the table, no voices bouncing off the walls, no drawings pinned to the fridge. He walked through the cavernous rooms, each one immaculate, each one echoing. The emptiness he had once considered luxury now felt like a punishment. Her chatter lingered in his ears, the way she had said, "Kaboom explode," the way she had declared that rockets meant freedom. He caught himself almost smiling before the feeling twisted into something else. Regret, loneliness. He couldn't be sure. He only knew that the echo of her small voice made the silence of his mansion unbearable. He stood at the window, staring at the quiet street beyond his gates. He told himself it had been a one-time thing. A fluke. He was not going to make a habit of walking children to school. He was a CEO, not a babysitter. And yet, beneath that rehearsed firmness, something small and unshakable stirred, a longing he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, without admitting it to himself, he found his feet carrying him to the gate a little earlier than usual. He told himself it was coincidence. He wasn't waiting by the gate. He was simply stepping outside early, getting some fresh air before heading into another marathon of meetings. That was the story he repeated in his head as he stood there, coffee in hand, glancing too often at his watch. He adjusted his tie, straightened his cuffs, and muttered about the chill in the air, but the truth was harder to ignore. He was waiting. Then he heard the light thump of sneakers on pavement. She appeared, as if summoned, her backpack bouncing against her small frame. She spotted him instantly and smiled, not in surprise but in certainty, as though she had known he would be there. She didn't even ask this time. She just walked up to him, gave a little nod, and started toward the school. He hesitated a moment, then fell into step beside her. This time, the silence didn't last long. "Look," she said, pulling a crumpled sheet of paper from her bag. "I drew my rocket." She held it up proudly, the pencil sketch smeared with eraser marks but filled with determination. Tall fins, a pointed nose, her name scrawled across the side in uneven letters. He took the paper gingerly, as though it were more fragile than any contract he had ever handled. "That's ambitious," he muttered, though his chest tightened strangely at the sight. "I'm gonna build one," she said with absolute conviction. "One that really works. And when it goes up, I'll be inside it." He raised an eyebrow. "And leave everything behind." "Not everything," she answered thoughtfully. "Just the boring stuff." Then she looked at him, her gaze sharper than her age suggested. "Don't you ever want to leave the boring stuff behind?" The question struck him harder than he expected. He had spent years convincing himself that money and power justified the grind, that his endless cycle of meetings and negotiations wasn't boring, it was success. Yet standing there, beside a child who dreamed of rockets, he couldn't summon an honest answer. By the time they reached the school gates, he realized he hadn't once looked at his watch. She waved quickly, then sprinted off, leaving the drawing in his hand. He folded it carefully, slipping it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. For reasons he couldn't explain, it felt like the most valuable thing he had carried in years. Word travels fast in neighborhoods where little changes. Within a week, whispers had already begun. The neighbors, who once only saw the grumpy millionaire behind tinted car windows, now saw him strolling down the sidewalk beside a little girl with uneven braids. Some peered from behind curtains, puzzled, others exchanged amused smiles while watering their lawns or collecting their mail. He noticed the looks, of course, he noticed everything, but he didn't care enough to stop. What surprised him most was how natural it began to feel. Each morning, he found himself by the gate without debate, coffee cooling in his hand until she appeared. And each morning, she greeted him with a grin that felt like sunlight breaking through the fog of his routines. The walk was short, but in that span, she filled the air with questions and dreams. She asked why the sky looked pink before the sun rose, why money was just paper, why some people smiled less than others. Some of her questions had answers, but many left him silent, staring at the world as if he were seeing it for the first time. One morning, as they passed a neighbor trimming his hedges, the man called out with a half smile, "Didn't know you had a granddaughter." The CEO opened his mouth to correct him, but the girl answered first, "He's not my grandpa. He's my friend." She said it simply, without hesitation, and continued walking. The words hung in the air long after. Friend. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had called him that. At the school gate, she waved as usual, but this time she doubled back, tugging at his sleeve. "You don't smile much," she observed frankly. "You should try. It feels good." He almost scoffed, almost brushed it off with the same cold retort he gave his employees. But the sincerity in her eyes stopped him. She believed what she said. She believed in him, in some small, stubborn way. That night, back in his mansion, he caught himself pulling the rocket drawing from his suit pocket. He set it carefully on his desk, far from the sterile contracts and reports. The silence of the house still loomed, but it no longer felt as impenetrable. For the first time in years, he wondered if change, real change, might be possible.